Welcome everyone. Today's webinar focused on the use of domestic public finance to support national adaptation plan processes. My name is Joellen Parry and I'm the adaptation lead at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, or IISD, which hosts the Secretariat of the NAP Global Network. Today I'm joined by two colleagues, Angie Dazé, also with IISD, who will be providing an overview of the role of domestic finance for the NAP process, and Edgar Hernán Cruz Martinez, a consultant with Colombia's Green Climate Readiness Programme, who will present on Colombia's experience with domestic finance. However, before speaking in greater depth about financing the NAP process using domestic sources, I'd like to provide you with a quick introduction to the NAP Global Network. The network was established at the end of 2014 at COP20 in Lima by developing countries and bilateral donors who recognize the growing importance of the NAP process and the need for enhanced support and coordination around it. We have initial financial support from Germany and the United States, with a number of new bilateral donors having joined the network recently, including Canada and Austria. We would consider our needs to be based on coordination of the efforts of the many actors who need to be involved in the NAP process, including domestic actors, but also the development partners supporting them. Learning about approaches and best practices for successful national adaptation planning and action based on the experiences that countries are gaining as they engage in the process is also one of our niches. Finally, the importance of bilateral support for the NAP process, particularly given the high proportion of bilateral support and adaptation in climate-sensitive sectors. We see all of these factors as key to our goal of enhancing national adaptation planning and action in developing countries. We currently have network participants in about 95 countries around the world and welcome you to join us if you are interested. To achieve the goals of the network, we work in the following areas: sustained peer learning and exchange, supporting national level action, and enhancing bilateral support for the NAP process. Some of the key components of these activities are listed on the slide before you, and I will identify some further information at the end of this webinar. To inform all of these activities, we also conduct analysis and develop communications and knowledge products on specific topics related to the NAP process. We aim to provide thought leadership on technical topics that are of interest to adaptation planners and those supporting them. One of the thematic areas of focus for the network is financing NAP processes. We recognize that there is significant literature and guidance available on how to finance adaptation in general. However, there's a general lack of guidance specifically on how to finance the NAP process and how this might contribute to achieving the adaptation goals of nationally determined contributions. To address this gap, a guidance note was recently prepared by the network through a collaboration by IISD and Germany's GIZ. This guidance is entitled Financing NAP Processes, Contributing to the Achievement of Nationally Determined Contribution Adaptation Goals. You can download this guidance in the Resources section of the NAP Global Network website. This webinar is one of a series of activities the network is undertaking that builds on the guidance provided in this document. At this point in time, I'd like to launch into the formal part of this webinar by providing an overview of the financing needs of the NAP process. My presentation will then be followed by Angie Dazé, who will provide an overview of domestic finance for the NAP process. Edgar Hernán Cruz Martinez will then speak about Colombia's domestic finance experience, and then there will be an opportunity for questions and answers from you. So on with my presentation. As we know, access to and effective utilization of finance will in part determine the success of the NAP processes being undertaken by a growing number of developing countries. Finance is needed throughout the NAP process, from its initiation to the identification and prioritization of adaptation actions and the establishment of monitoring and evaluation systems. Financing for the NAP process is also needed on an ongoing basis, given its iterative nature, as strategies and plans are periodically reviewed and updated, and new initiatives are launched. The scale of financing needed to support NAP processes can be understood by considering the two general types of costs that will need to be covered. Operating costs, or the ongoing costs associated with coordinating and facilitating that process. This includes costs for government personnel, rent, communications, etc. It also includes administrative and management costs, such as those associated with monitoring and evaluation of projects, programs, and initiatives. The second type of costs that will need to be covered are investment costs, or the costs associated with developing and maintaining infrastructure and technologies for adaptation. This includes construction costs and investment in public goods like education and health. Of these two types of costs, it is expected that significant financing will be needed to cover investment costs, such as those associated with the implementation of projects, programs, and initiatives. The amount of financing needed to cover the costs associated with the NAP process will vary from country to country, depending on a range of factors, such as the expected impacts of climate change within a country, the development context and adaptive capacity of a country, the extent to which adaptation planning and action has already been undertaken, and the number and scope of prioritized adaptation actions identified. However, despite these variations between countries, it's generally expected that significant financing will be required by all countries throughout the entire NAP process. When thinking about the NAP process and its financing requirements, it's helpful to divide the process into two phases, the development phase and the implementation phase. The development phase includes those activities related to the initiation, coordination, and maintenance of the NAP process. Consistent with the steps of the NAP technical guidelines produced by the Least Developed Countries Expert Group, this includes launching the NAP process and establishing institutional arrangements, undertaking preparatory activities such as climate vulnerability assessments, developing implementation strategies, including a financing strategy, and reporting, monitoring, and reviewing of the process on a continuous basis. The implementation phase encompasses all of the activities associated with the actual preparation and implementation of the individual actions prioritized through the development phase of the NAP process. This includes the preparation of detailed plans for prioritized adaptation projects, programs, and initiatives, including engagement with stakeholders, comprehensive cost estimates, and preparation of funding proposals. This phase also includes the implementation of prioritized adaptation actions. These actions could involve, for example, improving access to climate information and strengthening extension services, supporting access to and sustainable management of natural resources, or investing in infrastructure and technology, including early warning systems. Across both of these phases, investments will be needed in capacity development, institutional strengthening, and stakeholder engagement. The amount of financing needed for these two phases of the NAP process differs significantly. Although the development phase has a number of identified elements, financing will be needed to a greater extent in the implementation phase of the NAP process. This is because of the diversity of potential investments to be made in the implementation phase at different jurisdictional levels, in different sectors, and the range of activities that could be undertaken as part of efforts to adapt to the impacts of climate change. As well, different actors will need access to finance within these different phases. In the development phase, most of the costs associated with the NAP process are likely to be borne by government. This includes the ministry responsible for coordination of the NAP process. It also includes sectoral ministries, subnational authorities, and state agencies. These actors will need financing to support consultations with stakeholders, the development of sectoral strategies, access to new information, and the integration of adaptation into planning and budgeting processes. In the implementation phase, a wider range of actors will require access to financing. While government ministries and subnational governments will require financing to implement their planned adaptation actions, so too will actors outside of government, such as NGOs and the private sector. So where is all of this financing going to come from to cover the different costs associated with the different phases of the NAP process? It's possible to identify a range of sources of financing for the NAP process. These may be broadly characterized in two ways: whether the source is public or international, whether domestic or international, or whether the investor is public or private. Based on this characterization, some general sources of financing can be identified. As we will be discussing today, domestic public financing can come from national, sectoral, and subnational budgets. International public finance is also available, including financing from bilateral providers, multilateral funds such as the Green Climate Fund, and multilateral development banks. And third, you can get financing from private finance, including private financiers and private enterprises. Countries will need to combine financing from these different sources to support their NAP processes. Each of these sources of financing has their own characteristics, which make them suitable for financing activities associated with different phases of the NAP process. Given the number of potential sources of finance for the NAP process, a key challenge is determining how to align these sources with the financing needs of the development and implementation phases. A dedicated NAP financing strategy can play a pivotal role in ensuring a planned, coordinated, and coherent approach to identifying potential sources of finance for the NAP process and determining the steps by which this finance will be secured. It can, for example, help identify the costs that domestic finance can cover and the costs that it can't. Development of a NAP financing strategy should be initiated early within the NAP process and embedded within it. Its content should be tailored to the different needs and the adaptation objectives of a country, as well as its human resources and technical capacities. Its development should also be aligned with other national policies and initiatives, including a country's nationally determined contributions. The process by which a financing strategy is developed will vary from country to country, but may be understood to consist of three main building blocks. The first of these is identifying the financing gap. Countries are encouraged to identify the full extent of their expected costs throughout the entirety of the NAP process and over time. They can then determine whether some of these costs are already being met through their existing sources of finance, such as domestic budgets. This information can then be used to determine the gap between available resources and needed financing for the NAP process. The second building block is determining financing options. This analysis should be undertaken to determine which sources of financing may be most appropriate to meeting the financing needs of the NAP process. In making these decisions, countries should take into consideration their existing circumstances, relationships, and capacities, and also consider the financial instruments that will be used, such as whether or not they're going to be seeking grants or loans to finance the different activities planned. Finally, countries should also identify operational next steps. To ensure its effective implementation, a financing strategy should include a realistic and specific set of next steps. These next steps could include capacity building, informing key stakeholders, preparing proposals, or establishing monitoring and evaluation systems. And with this overview, I will turn the mic over to my colleague, Angie Dazé, who will provide an overview of the potential role of domestic public finance in supporting the NAP process.
Thanks, Joellen. As Joellen mentioned, I'm going to provide just a brief overview of the role that domestic public finance can play in the NAP process. When we talk about domestic public finance, we're referring to financial resources that are raised and managed by the government in a given country. This includes national development budgets, resources allocated for key sectors such as water and agriculture, and also budgets allocated to subnational authorities or non-state actors, such as NGOs or community-based organizations. Some countries are choosing to establish dedicated climate change funds, which often combine resources allocated by the government with funding from other sources. As you'll see on this slide, domestic public finance can support both the development and implementation phases of the NAP process. The challenge is ensuring that adaptation priorities are integrated into the planning processes and systems that drive budgeting, which has yet to occur in many countries. Domestic public finance is a relatively flexible source of funding that can support the NAP process in a number of different ways. It can be used to cover ongoing operational costs for the NAP process, such as human resources, equipment, and communication, as well as technical inputs and personnel time for integrating adaptation into relevant plans and budgets. Government budgets can also be used to invest in cross-cutting measures that enable implementation of adaptation actions, such as climate information services and monitoring and evaluation systems. Finally, these resources can be used for implementation of adaptation actions by government ministries, subnational authorities, or other actors, including non-state actors. This last point is key, as we know that the implementation of adaptation actions will largely occur at subnational levels, yet these actors may face barriers in accessing international sources of finance. This means that domestic budgets represent a key opportunity to channel funds to subnational authorities, NGOs, and communities. How this occurs will depend on the degree of decentralization that has already occurred in the country, and as well as on the systems that are already in place for transferring and tracking funds at subnational levels. The approach to allocating domestic finance for adaptation will really depend on the particular planning and budgeting cycle of a given country. But generally speaking, we can identify two key entry points. The first is the medium-term expenditure framework, which has a timeline of 3 to 5 years. These frameworks are generally based on a national development or economic strategy, and they provide an overview of planned expenditures and ceilings for allocation of resources for particular budget lines. In some countries, medium-term budgets are in place for sectors as well. The second opportunity for integrating adaptation spending is through the annual budgeting process, which sets out the yearly allocations for sectors, programs, or activities of the government and other actors. And this presents a great opportunity to integrate shorter-term actions into budgets and planning. For effective use of domestic budgets to finance the NAP process, there are a few key issues that country teams should keep in mind. Getting an understanding of the country's planning and budgeting procedures early on in the process can help to identify entry points and avoid missed opportunities. While the NAP process is generally led by the Environment Ministry or its equivalent, it can be really useful to involve decision makers in the finance and planning ministries to ensure that they understand the NAP process and the adaptation priorities, and that they're in a position to support integration into relevant planning and budgeting processes. Generally, actors in these ministries will need concrete cost estimates in order to move forward on allocating resources. So it's important to develop and improve cost estimates for adaptation priorities throughout the process. There may also be a need for capacity building and targeted guidance for relevant actors to ensure that adaptation priorities are effectively integrated into relevant sectoral budgets. It's important to note that the process of integrating adaptation in budgets may uncover weaknesses in existing systems that can limit effectiveness of the efforts to address climate change. When this occurs, there may be a need to work with finance or planning ministries to improve the systems to better enable integration of adaptation over time. Before closing, I'd just like to summarize the key benefits of using domestic finance for the NAP process. First, it can be a relatively predictable and consistent source of funding, which can be allocated through annual or medium-term budgeting processes. This is, of course, subject to changes in the context or shifts in government priorities, but in the absence of major upheavals, domestic finance has the potential to be more stable than other sources. As I mentioned, it can be applied throughout the NAP process in both the development and implementation phases. Using domestic budgets increases the likelihood that adaptation efforts will build on existing systems and institutional arrangements, in contrast with project-based approaches that may set up parallel systems. Domestic finance is controlled by the government, thereby enhancing national ownership of the NAP process. And finally, allocations from domestic budgets can be used to leverage other sources of funding for adaptation. For example, to implement pilot projects that can then be scaled up with international financing, or to promote investment in adaptation by the private sector. The last issue I want to mention is the potential of fiscal instruments as a mechanism for raising and redistributing revenues for adaptation. Fiscal instruments can be used to raise additional revenue, for example, through taxes on carbon-emitting industries, or to redistribute existing domestic resources, for example, through subsidies that promote uptake of technologies or practices that build climate resilience. Although these types of fiscal instruments are already being used to raise additional revenue for climate mitigation, experience with using them to finance adaptation actions is more limited. However, some early experiences are emerging, and with that, I'll hand it over to Edgar, who will share one such experience from Colombia.
Good morning or good afternoon for everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Edgar Cruz. I am a consultant of the GCF Readiness Programme, supporting the National Planning Department on building the National Climate Finance System. And based on what was shared by my previous colleague speakers, I want to say that the Colombian experience is quite aligned with all these international references, and what I will provide now is an insight on how Colombia is handling, how it's doing all this process of mobilizing domestic finance for the NAP process and overall for the adaptation planning and implementation in the country. So I will I will just provide a quick overview on what is going on the NAP process in Colombia. There was some reference by the previous speakers on the needs of costing, so I will provide some insight of what is doing Colombia on that, and I will focus on how the country is mobilizing finance for adaptation. Next. Regarding the national adaptation process in Colombia, this is called for as the National Plan of Adaptation to Climate Change. It has been, at the moment, this is one element of the National Climate Policy, so it is fully aligned with the National Development Plan and with the National Climate Policy. And since its beginning, it has been working on providing methodological guidelines and engagement to sectors and subnational level actors on how to understand, to secure awareness raising on adaptation, on the adaptation challenge that Colombia is facing. So based on that, a number of documents and guidelines has been produced, even recently now an online toolkit. And as a plan, it is now moving based with all the background and with all the history into an implementation phase. So really working closer with some national governments, with sectors to secure implementation through projects. On a second point, I will refer about adaptation finance needs assessment, and that has two elements. First, to refer that Colombia is among the number of developing countries that also did a specific pledge on adaptation action in its INDC. So there are actions aiming to secure that strategic economic sectors and ecosystems of the project are protected, and these actions at the moment the government is on the task of assessing how much can it cost, because some of these measures are more on the process side, like plan formulation, but from these plans it is expected to have a full picture and cost. As well on assessing adaptation, it is needed to highlight that Colombia is still working on the assessment. We know that there are uncertainties. We know that the climate trajectories are not fully clear, but still the country is preparing some assessment and we had the experience of the La Nina, an intensive rainy season, 2010-2011, and an assessment of how much costs to make infrastructure resilient. And you have the numbers in the screen of main infrastructure considered. And only to benefit 6 out of more or less 48 million inhabitants of the country, it is expected to cost, or it has cost also based on some estimation of reconstruction efforts, around $10 billion US. So we are talking about significant amounts of money that have to be mobilized. And of course, Colombia is moving towards a more integrated countrywide assessment of adaptation costs. And based on those first insights of needs, it comes how to mobilize the finance. And in that finance mobilization, Colombia has the experience with first organizing an institutional framework, and there is a national climate system, and it is specifically created a climate finance committee. So, and in that climate finance committee, we have an advisory body in which public and private sector actors exchange views on how to mobilize. It's a platform of socialization of initiatives. So I will refer next mainly to one of how many of these actions and priorities of the Climate Finance Committee are contributing to the mobilization of adaptation finance. And those are the ones that I will refer next. So regarding one of the main deliverables or outputs of this Climate Finance Committee, there is the Colombian Climate Finance Strategy that at the moment is a working document, but still it provides guidance, and it aims, it has a vision of really including securing that climate change criteria is included into the fiscal policy and project planning in the country, and securing also that the funding is sustainable, we can say also predictable and scalable. And for this climate finance strategy, there are a set of priorities. One, like the establishment of economic and financial instruments, the integration of climate criteria into public investment projects, and all what is needed of knowledge management and information. One element, of course, is a progress made by Colombia is tracking, because you know, as you know, every country needs to know, okay, how much money is being invested, and Colombia has recently completed a tracking on climate finance, and it has set up a system for this, so this information will be periodically ready and available. But our first estimations show that, okay, from 2000 to 2010, the country has invested yearly around $370 million in mitigation and adaptation. This has jumped after 2011 for the average between 2011 to 2015 of around $600 million US dollars. That is mainly explained because the cost of reconstruction of La Niña was included in this calculation, because many of this reconstruction included adaptation criteria. That also that partially explains the peak on the investment. And out of all this total investment, at the moment, 41% are targeting a specific adaptation. As another priority, Colombia is involving the private sector, and there is an initiative specifically with the financial sector through that is named the Pilot for Financial Innovation. Of course, they aim to serve green growth purposes, and it aims to align the financial sector with priorities like the NDC and the SDGs. And what is interesting to highlight is that there are at least out of the business model that are under development, because there are 6 specific business models that are under development. There are 2 that are aiming to address adaptation needs. One of them, for example, on resilient infrastructure. So how to make sure that the financial sector borrows money to infrastructure projects that take into account adaptation criteria, because that is an important volume on the bank's loans, expected loans in the country. As next, as an examples of domestic resource mobilization, Colombia has two examples. Colombia, for example, has a royalties system to allocate the revenue from the fossil fuels and mining exploration. And out of these royalties, there have been 2 important steps during the latest year. First, a declaration that taking into account disaster risk reduction and adaptation, all the projects need to prove, they need to present documentation that they are addressing such concerns into their design and expected implementation. On the experience on that, Colombia had the National Planning Department with other agencies had a time to structure this and to socialize. And we expect for the next telco to show the experience on how subnational level are addressing these new requirements, because we know in the central government that it adds further requirements for project structuring, but are further requirements that are needed to secure the resilience of the infrastructure. And another example is that a specific budget allocation was done for the current royalties budget, the biannual, and that this is like a separate track from what I referred before, and it's money specifically for this kind of projects. On the public-private partnerships, at least I want to refer, there was a recent gap assessment on what is missing on the current regime of public-private partnerships to make them resilient, and some recommendations like the adoption of resilient standards and more work needed by sectoral ministries is needed to secure effective planning of adaptation actions. I also want to highlight that Colombia has quite an innovative insurance model that has been implemented for the modernization of the roads and because it covers for many of the climate risks. I also want to refer that we see if we are talking about in domestic finance, I want to refer that we see international climate finance as an enabler, as a potential instrument to leverage domestic climate finance. So Colombia has a portfolio of potential projects for the GCF of 10 projects. 4 of them specifically addressing adaptation. One of them, for example, on insurance for small farmers, and another one on resilient water supply for a prone region, that is really prone to flooding. So if this portfolio of projects is implemented, Colombia expects to mobilize 1.2 billion, out of which more than 700 million will come from the mobilization of domestic funding sources. That as one element. And a second element, the mobilization of done by Colombia in the NAP readiness funding that Colombia is aiming to access around $2.7 million of this readiness for adaptation, that I aim to target the implementation of our NAP process, and this through addressing information and project structuring. It is also important to highlight international cooperation as enable and something that will enable further development. So through FFD, there are 2 consultancies helping us to understand cost of adaptation and feasible measures. And through IISD and the NAP network also supporting on the strengthening the implementation of the National Adaptation Plan, and with support of with support provided at sectoral and subnational level. And of course, as it was also mentioned by the previous speakers, subnational level engagement is key. We are working with different territories and to also to identify needs, to help to make the mobilization of their own funding to support project structuring. And finally, as a final remark, as key messages from this experience, I want to say that if we can summarize in one word how Colombia aims to mobilize domestic adaptation finance is through mainstreaming. So really securing that what is available, the channels that are available for funding includes adaptation criteria. Of course, we see the value on international funding sources as a means to enable further leveraging in Colombia and as a learning tool. And still, the challenges are ahead. We need a lot of much more work on building capacities, for example, on building projects, because how do you say at this moment what is your reasonable level of adaptation and residual risk if you are building a school, a road, or a hospital? So these are the kind of questions that the country is addressing, building the capacities, but still it would be much needed to further support the country on that. And with this, thank you so much. I hand over to my colleagues.
Great. Thank you very much, Edgar. At this point in time, I'd like to open up the webinar for the question and answer session. I believe that you can add questions into the chat box, and that the panelists, myself, Angie, or Edgar, will be pleased to provide you with a response to the questions that are received. Perhaps while we are waiting for any questions that you might have, I might be able to ask a question of Edgar. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about the insurance model that you have been using to support the development of your public-private partnerships that you mentioned earlier in your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much for the question. As I refer, the country had this rainy season, and the modernization of the road program also had to face partially the reconstruction of some roads. So one of the things when arranging public-private partnerships is how to address and how to allocate the risk to the part that can be more effective dealing it, as it is told in literature, and also how to secure that this there is an effective transfer of risk. So in this case, the insurance model aims to provide a sensible risk transfer so that both the constructors, the engineering company, the construction company, and the government can have this financial instrument in case a new event arrives, and there are the categories. So in this case, it's a transfer of risk. There are estimations on the cost, on the probability of events, and that is the base for this insurance model that aim to give confidence to constructors and to banks that the roads, and that the financial implications of a potential disruption can be diminished.
Okay, great. Thank you, Edgar. I can now see the questions before me, so I will read them out and try to answer some of them. The first question is, I would like to know if there are any initiatives taking place with Brazil. In terms of the work of the NAP Global Network, yes, we are engaged with Brazil. They are a member of the cohort that we have established that is engaged in our peer-to-peer learning process. And at the end of this presentation, I will be giving a bit more information about how it is that you might be able to become involved in that process, in the peer-to-peer learning activities of the network. The second question that is asked is, how do you quantify the needs for adaptation? If it's all right with Edgar, I think maybe I will pass that question on to you. Edgar, you have already gone through the process within Colombia of identifying the adaptation needs of the country. How is it that you went about quantifying those needs, and were there any particular tools that you used through that process?
Okay, thank you so much. On the experience that Colombia had, and with the case that was presented, for example, when a road had to be rebuilt, one of the criteria is, okay, how to make it more robust so that in some critical segments of the road, trouble is avoided in the future. I mean, Colombia is a mountainous country, so if there is a strong rain, there is a potential of landslides. So two solutions were adopted for that. So one adaptation measure that was adopted was building tunnels. So not going any longer on the edge of the mountain, but through it in a tunnel, and building viaducts. So in this case, adapting, this is like clear cut example, because you see that you can say, okay, you know how much can it cost a kilometer of road done conventionally, but if you add to that some segments, some kilometers of that road with the tunnel or the viaduct, then you have a clear, a larger cost. And these are the kind of estimates that are being done. For example, in the housing infrastructure, also how to secure that besides relocation, the height, if you are in an area prone to flooding, the basements are a little bit elevated, so that in case that you have a flooding, you can stand it. And those are elements that this additional cost is what is being also counted there. So there are issues on methodological issues, but still basically everything goes to having clear what's your threat, the threat that you are facing, your risk, assessing, taking your adaptation solution among a number of alternatives, and then you really, when you decide for one, based on also because you would like to adapt more, but you have budgetary constraints, then you, based on that, you make that costing of what is also feasible and affordable. I hope that helps to answer.
Okay. Great, thank you, Edgar. The next question that has been asked is if whether or not having a climate fund is part of a potential strategy for NAP financing. And this is actually one of the issues that we examined in our guidance note. Because yes, we do see that domestic climate change funds can play a role in financing the NAP process, particularly the implementation phase of the NAP process. While they can be a tool for both attracting international finance as well as domestic finance. And they can serve to help increase the financial management capacities of a country to better enable it to implement desired adaptation actions. There are, of course, a number of different funds that have been established through which different lessons can be learned, such as the Indonesia Climate Change Trust Fund or the Philippines People's Survival Fund. So these funds can play a role, but it's important for countries to really think through the potential purpose of the fund and whether or not it would going to be useful to establish a fund that is separate from the normal domestic financing processes, or whether or not it's going to be more useful to channel financial resources through existing domestic processes. And to also think about the need for both the establishment and operation of the climate fund over time to make sure that there's sufficient institutional and human resource capacity as well as an ability to raise financial resources over the long term. So with that, I think that I will move on to the next question, which I believe is most appropriate to be answered by you, Edgar. This is a question regarding how was adaptation mainstreaming done in the national policy and budgeting process, and what changes have been brought in the national banking sector to allow mobilization of finance for adaptation/resilient infrastructure.
Thank you so much for the question. I think, first of all, to refer that this is an ongoing learning process. Because, okay, there are the different levels of budget approval or competencies in the government. So I want to point out, it was referred also in the presentation by my colleagues, that there is a budgeting, okay, Colombia also in the medium-term financial framework of public budgeting has also included climate criteria into it, taking into account that at least the events of extreme climate variability are already costing the country. So there is already a clear signal for the next 10 years that these kind of events have to be included in the budget. So that is one example of learning. Second, for example, in the latest round of the subnational development plans, most of them, or basically all of them, included specific actions addressing climate concerns, the climate actions, ecosystem restoration, energy efficiency, promotion of mobility, with also serving adaptation purposes. So there is a task learning to do this mainstreaming. Of course, there is much more work to be done, but there are these concrete steps. I also refer the case of the royalty systems, in which a specific budget was allocated for it, also based on the review of the commitments of the country, and that, of course, all the NDC pledge on adaptation needs also funding to support it. And regarding the financial sector, let's say at the moment, Colombia is moving with a collaborative approach and then with the financial sector, the initiative that I refer of the pilot for financial innovation are aiming to have all this platform to define, okay, what is the business model that will allow money to flow into projects and solutions that are oriented to adaptation and mitigation. Okay, many things are a little bit more focused on mitigation, but adaptation is starting to be understood on all the implications. And if it is possible to see a way forward with the financial system, at least we can see also a very good learning from the financial sector, for some leading banks in the country, in the application of safeguards. And through these safeguards, the banks are already taking into consideration all the potential impacts of the project, and are having a tool also to decide on the allocation or not of loans. And I think this is a good example that needs to be also scaled up with the financial sector. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Edgar. We have about 5 minutes left officially for this webinar, so I'm going to try and answer the next two questions relatively quickly. The first one is whether or not there is a need to avoid the term subsidies to avoid the dependency syndrome. In the mitigation sector, They are starting to use other alternative terms like matching rebate to wean beneficiaries away from subsidies. In response to this question, Jason, I can definitely see that this is a concern and is not one that I would be able to address specifically. However, I'm sure that my colleagues within the Global Subsidies Initiative at IISD would definitely have an opinion on this. I think the most important thing is to think about the possibility of using subsidies as a way of encouraging investments by the private sector and by individuals in those activities that will build their resilience over time, and just explore whether or not this is actually going to be an effective strategy for financing the NAP process. The next question is about mining, and whether or not there are any initiatives in the mining industry, especially the artisanal small-scale mining sector, because many small-scale miners are affected by flooding issues and landslides that I think that are related to climate change. I am not as fully familiar as I should be regarding the initiatives within the mining sector, and particularly in relation to artisanal small-scale mining. But I do know that the mining sector is looking at the need to adapt, and there are initiatives that are some large companies have initiated to explore how it is that they can increase the resiliency of their mining operations to the impacts of climate change, and also the impacts of how they can increase the resiliency of the community surrounding them to the impacts of climate change. ICMM has done some work on this, and so if you wanted to take a look at their website, they may be able to provide some more information. In terms of whether or not it's specifically directed towards the small-scale miners, I'm not able to answer that question, although it is also an area in which IISD has been thinking about doing some research. And I think that the final question that I'm going to be able to ask would be again directed towards Edgar. The question is whether or not we can know the timeline, short-term, medium-term, or years covered, of the climate finance strategy of Colombia. And does the timeline for the financing strategy coincide or is similar with the timeline of the National Climate Change Action Plan? Edgar?
Yes, thank you. At the moment, the climate finance strategy has a vision for year 2030 because it is aligned with the NDC pledge that at the moment has that year as a reference. So the synchronization is there. That's the middle term vision. And in the current discussions, of course, there is also let's say a definition of sub-periods between that. Also to as it was presented by the colleagues on if while the country has advanced in some already concrete instruments, we still consider that there is a possible margin to design or to expand the scale of some mechanism, and that this will be like expected to cover some phases of the future on this program. So this timeline has this vision to 2030, and when the document is released, it is expected to also reflect some more specific periods in which we want to see more specific progress or expected action in the future.
Okay, great. Thank you, Edgar. At this point in time, I'm going to bring the webinar to a close. I would first like to thank our panelists, Angie and Edgar, for their presentations and their valuable insights that they have been able to provide. I would also like to help. I'd also like to let you know that we have recorded this webinar, and it will be posted along with the PowerPoint presentations you've just seen on our website for reference, and for anyone interested who was unable to join us today. There's a short evaluation survey that should launch at the end of the webinar, and also will be shared in a follow-up email to you. We greatly appreciate it if you could take a couple minutes to share your feedback. Before we close, I'd also like to give you a quick sense of how you might become involved with the network. A first step for getting involved in the network is registering online as a participant. This is free, open to all, and can be done on an individual basis. We keep participants up to date on our webinars and other activities, recent publications, knowledge products, and NAP-related news more broadly. Participants working for developing country governments can access short-term targeted technical support through our country support hub and get involved in peer learning and exchange through our South-South Peer Exchange Program. Bilateral donors can collaborate with us to share information on your NAP-relevant support, coordinate with other donors, and participate in network meetings and activities to learn from other donors and partner countries. I'd also like you to look for other opportunities and webinars that we will be hosting in the coming weeks, also focused on finance and looking at it from different perspectives, whether on the international and the private sector. Finally, as also, don't hesitate to be in touch with us through the email address on your screen. Should you have any questions or are interested in learning more about how you could get involved with the NAP Global Network. Thank you.